My dad said we are only inviting you out of pity, so do not stay long. I just smiled, took a sip of my drink, and quietly paid the bill. 4 days later, they found out I had sold the family cabin. The place they relied on for summer vacations was gone. Their bank accounts were frozen. The legal letter arrived today. Panic started. My name is Audrey, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers at Prime Cut Steakhouse cast a warm glow over our table, but the atmosphere felt like an interrogation room. We were gathered for a supposedly celebratory family dinner ahead of our annual summer trip. Instead, I sat silently while my father Richard tapped his silver knife against his wine glass. He stood up, his custom suit straining against his shoulders. I expected a toast. Instead, his eyes locked onto mine. "We are only inviting you out of pity to the Tahoe cabin next week, Audrey," he announced, his voice booming. "So do not stay long and ruin the mood." My mother Patricia nodded in agreement. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out the receipt folder, and tossed it across the table. It landed right next to my plate. The bill was for $4,000. "Since you are 33, single, and renting a cheap box downtown, paying is the least you can do." My mother sneered. "It is your only useful contribution since your career went nowhere." My sister Caroline giggled, leaning into her husband David. David is an investment finance executive, a sharp-dressed African-American man who always wore an arrogant smirk. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe Audrey can put it on a payment plan," David joked. "I hear low-level office assistants do not bring home big bonuses." I looked around the table. My father Richard spent his life projecting old money wealth, masking the fact that he was drowning in hidden debts. My mother Patricia was his perfect enabler, pragmatic, critical, and completely devoid of maternal warmth. She constantly compared me to Caroline. Caroline was the golden child, living a fake, lavish lifestyle funded entirely by debt, and her husband and his questionable financial maneuvers. They saw me as the quiet employee who failed to launch. They thought my business degree was a waste of tuition money. They had no idea that I was actually the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Commercial Real Estate. I spent my days acquiring multi-million-dollar properties and building a self-made empire. I preferred stealth wealth while they chased loud luxury. "You should be grateful we even tolerate your presence," my father added. "Having you moping around the cabin is embarrassing. We are doing you a favor by letting you tag along." Caroline leaned forward. "Dad is right, Audrey. This trip is important for David and his firm. We are hosting a major fundraising gala at the cabin to secure new investors. We cannot have you bringing down the energy. Just stay in the back guest room and try not to bother anyone." David chimed in again, smoothing his suit lapels. "We need absolute perfection for this gala. My clients expect a certain level of sophistication. No offense, Audrey, but your whole vibe is too depressing for the crowd we are trying to attract. Just pay the bill and consider it your entry fee to our world." The audacity was breathtaking. They were openly humiliating me in a crowded restaurant, demanding I pay a $4,000 dinner bill and telling me I was only allowed in my own family summer home out of pure pity. Any normal person would have thrown a glass of water in their faces and stormed out. I was not a normal person. I was a woman who had spent a decade building an ironclad emotional fortress against their toxicity. I looked down at the leather folder. The printed receipt listed premium steaks and vintage wine that I had not even tasted. I looked back up at my family. My mother was glaring at me, expecting me to argue. My father was practically daring me to speak up and defend myself so he could crush me with another cruel remark. Caroline and David were just waiting for me to break down. Instead, I reached into my purse. I bypassed the standard debit cards and pulled out a solid, heavy, matte black corporate card. There was no name printed on the front, only the logo of a banking institution that catered strictly to ultra-high net worth clients. I placed the card onto the receipt tray. None of them recognized what it was. To them, it was just another plastic card from a worthless woman. I did not cry at all. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my career or explain my actual net worth. I simply smiled a calm, chilling smile that made my mother blink in confusion. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water and looked my father dead in the eye. "It is my absolute pleasure," I said smoothly. "I will just leave you to enjoy your evening right now." I turned my back on their stunned faces and walked out of the restaurant with my head held high. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside. I pulled out my phone and opened my secure banking application. With one quick tap, I authorized a $5.5 million real estate transaction. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message for me. "Transaction is complete. Property demolition scheduled." The exact 4-day countdown to their complete and utter destruction had officially begun. The distance from our table to the front host stand was exactly 42 steps. I counted them as I walked. Counting always grounded me when my family tried to strip away my composure. Behind me, the harsh scrape of my father's chair pushing back against the hardwood floor cut through the ambient jazz of the restaurant. He was deeply irritated that I had not argued with him. He thrived on the argument. By denying him the public fight he so desperately wanted, I had bruised his fragile ego. I kept my posture perfectly straight, feeling the collective glare of my family boring into my spine. My mother was likely already whispering to Caroline about my terrible attitude and lack of gratitude. I did not care. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the steakhouse with its dark mahogany paneled walls and the scent of expensive cigars clinging to the upholstery suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. I was finally walking away from their narrative. The maitre d' was a polished older man named Henri. He watched me approach with a practiced neutral expression. He had seen my father snap his fingers at the waitstaff earlier in the evening. He had heard David loudly complaining about the vintage of the Bordeaux they were served. Henri slid the black leather billfold across the marble counter toward me. I did not open it to verify the charges. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my leather tote bag and withdrew my card. It was not the standard plastic credit card my family assumed I carried in my wallet. It was solid titanium. It was matte black and heavy to the touch. It bore no personal name and no commercial bank logo that the general public would ever recognize. It featured only a subtle geometric insignia engraved in the top right corner. The card was exclusively issued to corporate entities with liquid assets exceeding $50 million. Henri took the card from my hand. The unexpected weight of the metal in his palm made him pause. His eyes flicked from the card to my face, and his entire professional demeanor shifted instantly. The polite indifference melted into profound, practiced respect. He recognized exactly what he was holding and what kind of financial backing it represented. He processed the transaction in absolute silence. Across the dining room, David's booming voice carried over the low hum of the other patrons. He wanted to make sure the neighboring tables heard him. "I hope you checked your credit limit, Audrey," David called out, letting out a sharp, barking laugh. "That is a steep bill for a single girl on a fixed income. Do not come crying to me when your card declines and they make you wash dishes in the back to work off the steak." Caroline chimed in right on cue, her voice dripping with fake concern. "David, leave her alone. She probably opened one of those high-interest travel cards just to feel included tonight. She is going to be eating instant noodles for the next 12 months to pay off Dad's ribeye. Let her have her moment in the spotlight." I stood at the counter, waiting for the receipt to print. I did not turn around to face them. I let their voices echo in the dining room, exposing their own profound insecurities to everyone listening. David was wearing a leased luxury watch and driving a sports car financed up to the roof. His entire existence was built on leverage and appearing wealthy to his firm's senior partners. Caroline spent her days curating an aesthetic on social media that required constant cash injections from my father. My father was secretly drowning in bad debts he hid from my mother just to maintain his country club membership. They were loud because they were hollow inside. I was quiet because I was solid. My father's booming laughter joined David's cruel chuckles. It was a harsh sound that I had spent my entire childhood running from. Tonight it sounded different. It sounded like a death rattle. They honestly believed they held all the power because they controlled the social narrative. In the world of high finance where David pretended to be a king, silence is the ultimate weapon. Real wealth does not need to scream across a steakhouse. Real wealth signs the check and buys the building. Henri handed me the receipt and a silver pen. I glanced at the total. $4,250. I added a $1,000 tip for the waiter, who had to endure my father's condescension all evening. I signed the slip with a quick fluid motion. "Thank you for your exceptional service tonight, Henri," I said softly. He bowed his head slightly. "Have a wonderful evening, madam," he replied, handing back the heavy titanium card. I slid it back into my bag. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The chill of the city wind was an instant physical relief against my skin. The suffocating heat of my family's expectations vanished the moment the doors swung shut behind me. The valet asked if I needed my car brought around to the front. I politely declined, telling him I preferred to walk. I needed the cold air to clear the lingering stench of my father's cigar smoke from my clothes. I walked half a block down the illuminated avenue before stopping under the glow of a street lamp. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I bypassed my standard personal applications and opened a heavily encrypted secure gateway. The biometric scanner read my face and required a secondary thumbprint verification to proceed. The screen dissolved into the stark minimalist interface of the Apex Group Commercial Holdings portfolio. This was the empire I had built entirely in the shadows, away from their judgment. I navigated to the real estate assets division. I scrolled past the downtown office high-rises, the suburban strip malls, and the industrial complexes I had acquired over the last 5 years. I stopped at a residential listing, categorized under tax liabilities: the Lake Tahoe property. The very cabin my family was planning to use next week to flaunt their imaginary wealth to David's investors. The cabin they just told me I was only allowed to visit out of pity. For a decade, I had quietly paid the exorbitant property taxes and the brutal maintenance fees on that Tahoe cabin. I paid the winterizing costs and the security retainers. I did it because my grandfather asked me to protect the asset from my father's reckless gambling habits. My family spent every summer lounging on that wraparound cedar deck, drinking expensive wine, and taking photographs to prove their elite status. They hosted lavish parties and boasted about their real estate holdings. They treated me like an unwanted guest in a house my money was keeping afloat. Next week, David planned to use my deck to court new money for his failing investment fund. He needed the optics of the Tahoe cabin to convince his clients he was solvent. He needed the illusion of stability to hide the massive holes in his own corporate ledgers. They had no idea that I legally owned the ground they walked on. I selected the property profile. I opened the pending actions tab. A commercial redevelopment contract sat waiting for my final approval. The buyer was a subsidiary shell company I also controlled. The sale price was listed at exactly $5.5 million. This internal transfer would trigger a massive taxable event designed specifically to smoke out my father's fraudulent paperwork. I took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. I tapped the screen. Confirm transfer. The biometric scanner flashed one final time. A green loading bar swept across the digital interface. The screen refreshed, displaying a stark automated message in bold white letters. Transaction complete. Property demolition scheduled. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The 4-day countdown had officially begun. 4 days later, I sat in the high-back leather chair of my corner office. A massive flat-screen monitor was mounted on the wall directly across from my desk. I had instructed my lead demolition foreman to set up a live-feed security camera facing the main driveway of the Lake Tahoe property. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, leaned back and watched the broadcast. The timing was absolutely perfect. On the high-definition screen, I watched the sleek matte black shape of David's leased luxury SUV crunch onto the gravel driveway of the mountain estate. I knew exactly what was going through their minds in that moment. Caroline was undoubtedly checking her reflection. adjusting her designer sunglasses, and mentally drafting her social media posts for the weekend. She had spent the last 2 months bragging to her elite circle of friends about the exclusive mountain gala she was hosting. She had hired a private catering company, a string quartet, and a team of valet drivers who were scheduled to arrive in less than 3 hours. David was driving. I could see the rigid tension in his shoulders even through the camera feed. He desperately needed this weekend to project an image of untouchable old money wealth. He had invited 3 prominent venture capitalists from Silicon Valley to this gala. He was courting their funds to cover up the massive hidden losses in his own investment portfolios. He had leveraged his entire professional reputation on the illusion of stability that this cabin represented. The SUV rounded the final cluster of pine trees, expecting to find the sprawling, pristine cedar and stone vacation home. Instead, David slammed on the brakes so hard the heavy vehicle skidded sideways in the dirt. Through the audio feed, I heard the screech of the tires, followed immediately by Caroline screaming in shock. They threw open the doors of the vehicle and stepped out into the crisp alpine air. They were completely paralyzed by the scene unfolding in front of them. A towering 8-foot chain-link fence completely surrounded the perimeter of the property. Neon orange caution tape snapped violently in the mountain wind, tied to heavy concrete barricades. The peaceful sounds of the forest were completely drowned out by the deafening roar of heavy diesel machinery. Thick black exhaust hung in the air. Right in the center of the manicured lawn where my mother used to host her summer garden parties sat a massive yellow bulldozer. As Caroline and David stood frozen in the driveway, the machine lurched forward. The steel claw raised high into the air, blocking out the sun, and crashed down directly onto the custom wraparound cedar deck. The same deck where my father smoked his imported cigars and mocked my career. The heavy wood splintered and shattered, echoing like a bomb blast across the lake. Caroline dropped her expensive handbag in the dirt. She ran toward the chain-link fence, grabbing the metal wire and screaming at the top of her lungs. "Stop it right now. Turn those machines off. You have the wrong house. You are destroying my family property." A burly construction foreman in a bright yellow hard hat walked over to the fence carrying a thick metal clipboard. He did not look amused. He pointed a thick finger at Caroline, warning her to step back from the active demolition zone. David rushed up beside his wife, trying to project his usual arrogant corporate authority. He puffed out his chest and raised his voice over the roaring engines. "I am David Sterling. This is my father-in-law's estate. You have made a catastrophic legal error, and I will personally see to it that your company is sued into bankruptcy. Turn those engines off immediately." The foreman laughed, a deep, booming sound that carried clearly through my office speakers. "We do not make errors, buddy," he said, pulling a heavy laminated document from his clipboard and pressing it against the chain-link fence for David to read. "Apex Group bought this land clear and free. The demolition permits were approved and finalized by the county 3 days ago. Now move your leased truck out of my driveway before it gets hit by flying debris." David leaned in to read the permit. I watched the exact second his arrogant facade shattered into a million pieces. The blood drained completely from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The paperwork was ironclad. Hammered deep into the earth right beside the driveway was a massive aluminum sign. The bold black lettering was impossible to miss. It read, "Property of Apex Commercial Real Estate. Demolition in progress. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Caroline began having a full hyperventilating meltdown in the dirt. Her perfect weekend was completely obliterated. The elite caterers would be arriving to a construction site. The billionaire investors would be arriving to a pile of rubble. Her social standing was turning to ash right in front of her eyes. David began pacing frantically, clutching his chest as the reality of his financial ruin set in. His firm was going to collapse without those investors. Caroline pulled her phone from her pocket, her hands shaking violently. She dialed our father. I watched her shriek into the receiver, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Dad, they are tearing down the cabin. There is a fence and a bulldozer. Some company called Apex Group is destroying the house. Do something right now." I knew my father was likely standing on the manicured green of his exclusive country club miles away, completely blindsided. I knew he was dropping his golf club, refusing to believe the words coming out of his favorite daughter's mouth. I knew he was screaming that he owned the cabin and that he would handle it. I knew his next move would be to call the daughter he viewed as his obedient, quiet scapegoat, assuming I had simply failed to pay a tax bill. I sat back in my leather chair and took another sip of black coffee. The live feed continued to show the bulldozer ripping the roof off the family legacy. Right on cue, my cell phone vibrated on the polished oak surface of my desk. The caller ID flashed my father's name in bright white letters. I let it ring 3 times, listening to the soothing hum of the city traffic far below my window. I enjoyed the vibration against the wood. I picked up the phone and pressed accept. I did not say hello. I just waited in the silence. My father's voice exploded through the speaker, shaking with an unprecedented, unhinged rage. "Audrey, what the hell have you done?" I held the phone slightly away from my ear. My father was screaming so loudly, the audio distorted through the small speaker. His voice was a violent weapon he had used to control our family for decades. He demanded to know why there was a bulldozer in his front yard. He threatened to call the local sheriff immediately. He threatened to have me thrown in federal prison for the rest of my natural life for the illegal sale of his property. He called me a thief. He called me a delusional, ungrateful child who was finally showing her true colors. I let him rage. I let him scream until his vocal cords were raw. I wanted him to exhaust his initial burst of adrenaline. In literature and storytelling, silence is a powerful tool. I used it now to let his panic echo back to him. When he finally paused to take a breath, his heavy panting filled the silence. My voice was calm and steady. I told him he could not call the sheriff. I told him if he called the police, he would be the one leaving in handcuffs for filing a false report. "You cannot trespass on your own property, Dad," I said. "And you certainly cannot steal what already belongs to you." He laughed a harsh, panicked sound. He called me psychotic. He said he had the deed locked securely in his heavy iron safe in his study. He swore he would ruin my life for this sick prank. He swore he would make sure I never worked in this city again. I corrected him. I told him he had a useless piece of paper. I told him to listen to me very carefully because I was only going to say this once. 10 years ago, Grandfather Theodore called me into his study. It was exactly 3 weeks before his heart gave out. He handed me a sealed manila folder containing the actual legally binding transfer of the Lake Tahoe deed. He signed it over to me completely. He bypassed my father entirely. He bypassed my mother. He completely cut out Caroline. My father demanded to know why. His voice trembled with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He demanded to know why his own father would betray him like that. I told him the ugly truth that everyone in our family pretended not to see. Grandfather knew about the underground poker games. He knew about the massive, staggering debts my father was racking up at the country club just to maintain a pathetic illusion of wealth. Grandfather knew that if he left that beautiful cabin to my father, it would be leveraged and lost to bookies within a single year. He gave it to me because he knew I would protect it. He gave it to me because I was the only responsible adult in a family of overgrown, entitled children. Then I explained the harsh reality of the last decade. 10 years. For 10 long years, I carried the crushing financial burden of that estate entirely on my own shoulders. I told my father exactly how much the property taxes were in that exclusive Nevada zip code. I listed the expensive winterizing fees, the structural roof repairs, the mandatory security retainers. I reminded him of every single family dinner where he and my mother openly mocked my cheap apartment. I reminded him of every time Caroline laughed at my outdated clothes. They called me a failure. They called me broke. They told their wealthy country club friends I was a mid-level assistant who could barely afford groceries. Meanwhile, my entire salary for the first 5 years of my career went straight to keeping a roof over their heads. I paid for their luxury. I subsidized their fake wealth. I allowed them to host their lavish summer parties and take their perfect family photos on a deck that I legally owned. I endured their endless cruelty. I endured their vicious passive-aggressive comments. I endured it all just to honor my grandfather's final wish to keep the family retreat intact. I suffered in silence so they could play pretend. I swallowed my pride for 10 years. They pushed me entirely too far, so I stopped paying for their illusion. I sold the property to my own holding company to trigger a massive legal demolition. I decided it was time to literally tear down the fake foundation they built their lives upon. The line went dead silent. The booming, arrogant patriarch of our family was suddenly utterly speechless. His entire reality was crumbling around him in real time. The daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like absolute garbage was actually his landlord. The realization that he owned absolutely nothing hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The silence stretched on heavy and suffocating. He had no counter-argument. He had no insults left to throw. The undeniable truth had completely paralyzed him. Then the dynamic abruptly shifted. The silence was broken. I heard a violent, chaotic scuffle on the other end of the line. Caroline was shrieking hysterically in the background, crying about her ruined gala and her destroyed social reputation. Someone snatched the phone directly from my father's trembling hand. It was David. His smooth, polished finance executive voice was completely gone. He sounded frantic. He sounded erratic. He sounded incredibly dangerous. The perfect facade was finally cracking. The arrogant game was over, and the real panic was just beginning. David's voice came through the speaker. It was tight and breathless. The booming confidence he carried in the steakhouse was entirely gone. It was replaced by a desperate, manic energy. He was trying to sound authoritative, but the tremor in his throat betrayed him. He cleared his throat loudly. He tried to lower his pitch. He wanted to project control. He wanted to force me back into the tiny, silent box I had lived in for 32 years. Audrey, listen to me very carefully, David said. His words were clipped and rushing together. You are completely out of your depth here. You are playing a dangerous game with assets you do not understand. What you just did constitutes a massive breach of fiduciary duty. You are acting recklessly. You are exposing the entire family portfolio to catastrophic legal liability. I need you to stop this demolition right now. Do you hear me? Stop the machines. I did not answer. I let his rapid breathing fill the silence. The silence stretched. The silence grew heavy. The silence was my weapon, and I wielded it without mercy. Audrey, he snapped. The false calm was already fracturing. This is not a joke. This is high-level corporate finance. You cannot just sell a prime real estate asset to a shell company and bulldoze it. You are violating basic fiduciary protocols. You are inviting a massive lawsuit from my firm. I am trying to shield you from federal prosecution. I need you to reverse the sale immediately. He was lying. He was lying, and he was sweating, and he was terrified. I shifted in my leather chair. I looked at the security feed on my wall monitor. The bulldozer was currently tearing through the master bedroom. The roof was collapsing in a shower of splintered wood and gray dust. I am not reversing anything, David, I said. My voice was a flat, emotionless line. The transaction is complete. The money has cleared. The property is gone. He gasped. It was a sharp and ugly sound. He wildly repeated the phrase. Okay. Okay, listen to me. You need to wire those funds to my firm's holding account immediately. I will text you the routing numbers. You need to wire the $5.5 million today, Audrey. Right now. You need to secure the family assets in a protected corporate account. My fund can absorb the capital and shield it from the tax liabilities you just triggered. Send the wire, send the money, send it now. Send the money, send the money, send the money. His desperation was a palpable living thing crawling through the phone. He was begging. The golden boy of finance was begging the sister he despised. Why would I send my money to your failing fund, David? I asked. I am protecting the family. He screamed. The mask completely shattered. His voice cracked into a hysterical shriek. "You stupid, arrogant girl! You have no idea what you just did. You have no idea the cascade you just triggered. You just destroyed everything. You destroyed me." I leaned heavily on the polished oak desk. "What exactly did I destroy, David? Tell me." He was panting heavily. The background noise on his end was pure chaos. Caroline was still sobbing hysterically. My father was shouting obscenities at the construction crew. But David was isolated in his own private nightmare. He was cornered. He was trapped. He was out of options and out of time. "I had a margin call," David blurted out. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a frantic rush of panic and defeat. I had a massive margin call on a leveraged tech portfolio. The market dropped. The partners demanded liquidity. I needed capital to cover the spread. I needed collateral. "I used the cabin. You used my cabin," I stated. I wanted him to say it clearly. I wanted him to articulate every single syllable of his crime. "I did not know that it was yours," he screamed, crying now. "I thought it was Richard's property. I thought it was family property. I forged the authorization. I leveraged the deed for a commercial bridge loan to cover the margin call. I put the cabin up as collateral. The bank sent the appraisers last week. The investors are coming this weekend to finalize the equity transfer. They needed to see the physical asset. They needed to see the collateral. And you just bulldozed it. You bulldozed my collateral. The bank is going to call in the loan. The investors are going to pull their funding. I am completely exposed. You have to send me the 5 million, Audrey. You have to save me. I will go to prison. I will go to prison. I will go to prison. I will go to prison." He repeated the phrase like a broken record. The repetition laid bare his absolute terror. The repetition revealed the hollow, terrified core of his existence. He had gambled with property he did not own. He had forged documents to secure millions. He had built his entire identity on theft and deception. I sat back in my chair. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked at the secondary monitor on my desk. The audio recording software displayed a continuous red waveform, capturing every single word of our conversation, every frantic plea, every desperate admission, every clear, undeniable confession. "David," I said softly. "What?" he gasped. "Just send the wire, Audrey, please. You just confessed to securing a commercial loan using a forged deed for a property you do not own," I said. The coldness in my voice was absolute. "You just admitted to bank fraud. You just admitted to wire fraud. You just admitted to federal crimes on a recorded line." The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a man stepping off a cliff. It was the silence of a man realizing there was no net to catch him. I did not wait for David to formulate a pathetic defense or attempt to walk back his confession. I simply pressed the red icon on my screen and ended the call. The silence in my office was immediate and profound. I exported the audio file to 3 separate encrypted offshore servers to ensure the evidence was completely untouchable. I knew my family. I knew their desperation. I knew that cornered animals bare their teeth and slash wildly before they completely collapse. I went home that evening and slept better than I had in a decade. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my phone vibrating violently against the nightstand. It was a relentless mechanical buzz. It buzzed, it buzzed, it buzzed. The vibration dragged me from my peaceful sleep and signaled the immediate beginning of their frantic counteroffensive. They had realized that private manipulation would no longer work on me. They had chosen public warfare. I picked up the device. The screen was completely choked with notifications. There were dozens of aggressive text messages. There were hundreds of social media alerts. There were missed calls from numbers I had not seen since high school. I bypassed the text messages and opened my primary social media application. My feed was instantly dominated by a single video. It had already amassed tens of thousands of views and hundreds of shares within our affluent Boston and New York social circles. It was Caroline. She was sitting on the pristine white sofa of her luxury living room. She was wearing an oversized gray cashmere sweater that dwarfed her frame, making her look incredibly small and fragile. Her hair was pulled into a messy knot. Her face was entirely bare of makeup except for the subtle, perfectly applied redness around her eyes to simulate hours of desperate crying. It was a masterful performance. It was a carefully calculated piece of digital theater designed entirely to destroy my character. I tapped the screen to play the video. Caroline stared directly into the camera lens with wide, tear-filled eyes. She took a shuddering, dramatic breath. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," she began, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "But my family is in crisis. We are being targeted by someone we loved. My older sister Audrey has suffered from severe mental instability for years. We tried to help her. We tried so hard to protect her." Caroline wiped a single perfect tear from her cheek. "Yesterday, she committed an act of unspeakable cruelty. She manipulated legal loopholes to steal our grandfather's estate. The mountain cabin that held all our beautiful childhood memories is gone. She hired a demolition crew to bulldoze our family legacy out of pure, petty jealousy. She rendered us homeless for the summer. She destroyed my parents' sanctuary just to inflict pain." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. The caption below the video read, "Heartbroken. Please send prayers for my family dealing with a severely disturbed and dangerous relative." The comment section was a toxic wasteland of misplaced outrage. The country club elites, the finance executives, the high society matrons, they all rallied instantly behind Caroline's manufactured grief. I opened my direct messages. The vitriol poured out of the screen in an endless digital flood. My Aunt Lucille called me a greedy, disgusting monster. My cousin Julian told me I belonged locked inside a psychiatric ward. People I had not spoken to in 15 years flooded my inbox to hurl insults. They called me selfish. They called me evil. They called me a monster. I stared at the glowing screen. The injustice of it burned like acid in my chest. The pain was sharp. The pain was deep. The pain was an old familiar friend. For 10 years I had paid their bills. For 10 years I had subsidized their illusions. For 10 years I had protected them. And they so easily rallied a digital mob to tear my reputation apart. The betrayal echoed loudly in my mind. They hated me. They hated me. They hated me. The repetition of their cruelty was staggering. They chose the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. They chose Caroline's fake tears over my silent sacrifice. I did not respond to a single message. I let the hatred wash over me, because I knew it was built on a foundation of sand. Suddenly, a new notification popped onto the screen, overriding the flood of social media hate. It was an urgent voicemail from my mother, Patricia. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the recording. Her voice was not weeping like Caroline's. Her voice was ice-cold and dripping with absolute unhinged venom. "Audrey," she hissed into the receiver, "you have completely humiliated this family for the last time. Your little stunt with the property was pathetic and desperate. You think you are powerful, but you are nothing. You are a mid-level employee playing dress-up in a world you do not understand. If you do not wire the $5.5 million to David's account within 24 hours, I will personally call your little office boss. I will expose your mental instability to your entire corporate department. I will make sure you are fired and blacklisted from every firm in the city. You have 24 hours, Audrey. Send the money or I will end your miserable career." I lowered the phone and smiled. Patricia still thought I was a junior marketing assistant, desperately clinging to a paycheck. She had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire corporate firm she was threatening to call. She was threatening to expose my actions to my own board of directors. Her blind arrogance was breathtaking. She was trying to play chess while I had already flipped the entire board. The trap was perfectly set. I took a very deep breath and quietly prepared to finally crush them all completely. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite violently swung open. The sudden crash of thick mahogany hitting the drywall echoed across the quiet floor. My assistant Sarah tried to block the wide doorway holding a tablet like a shield. "You cannot barge in here. Miss Wilson is in a private meeting. Get out of my way, you glorified secretary." Patricia shoved past Sarah with aggressive physical force. Richard stormed into the room right behind her. His face was a dark mottled purple, and the veins in his thick neck were bulging. I raised my hand, signaling Sarah to step down. "It is fine, Sarah. Close the door and hold all my calls for 10 minutes. Richard marched straight across the expensive carpet and slammed his large, meaty hands flat onto the surface of my desk. He leaned his massive frame forward, trying to intimidate me into submission. "You think you are so clever, Audrey," Richard growled. "You think you can steal $5.5 million from this family and just sit here playing businesswoman. The game ends right now." Patricia stepped up beside him. Her eyes darted around, taking in the custom artwork and the sheer scale of the executive suite. She assumed I was just squatting in a senior manager's office. "I warned you last night, Audrey," Patricia hissed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "I told you I would come down here and expose your mental instability to every partner in this building. I will have you escorted out by the police. You will never work in this industry again. You have humiliated us for the absolute last time." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, resting my hands gently on my lap. I did not flinch or break eye contact. "Go ahead, Mom," I offered softly. My voice was a flat, emotionless, steady line. "Walk out into the bullpen and start screaming. Tell everyone exactly who you think I am. I would love to see the look on the managing partners' faces when you try to get their boss fired." Richard slammed his fist against the desk, rattling my coffee cup. "Shut your mouth. You are a thief. You exploited a sick old man to steal a property deed and fraudulently sold it to a shell company. David is facing federal indictment because of your psychotic stunt. The bank is freezing the firm's assets by noon today. We are entirely out of time." He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and threw them violently across my desk. "This is a full legal retraction and an immediate wire transfer authorization." Richard demanded, his heavy breathing filling the room. "You are going to authorize the immediate transfer of the $5.5 million directly into David's holding account. Then you are going to sign a sworn affidavit stating you orchestrated the sale under severe mental duress. Sign the papers, Audrey. If you do not sign them right now, I will have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs for corporate sabotage." I looked down at the scattered documents. The margins were crooked. The desperation of their situation was baked into every single paragraph. They had scrambled their legal team in the middle of the night to draft a completely unenforceable contract. I slowly reached for the heavy silver cup holding my pens. I selected a bright red felt tip marker. I clicked the cap off with a sharp snap. "What are you doing?" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with rising panic. "Stop playing games and sign the transfer. We are losing the fund." I pulled the first page of the contract toward me. "You hired a terrible attorney, Richard." I dragged the red pen across the third line, crossing out a massive block of text. "You cannot claim breach of fiduciary duty when I never held a fiduciary obligation to your son's private equity firm. That is basic corporate law." I flipped to the second page. I circled a glaring typographical error in the middle of the transfer authorization. "You misspelled irrevocable right here." My red pen slashed through the incorrect letters. "If you are going to threaten me with federal prosecution, you should at least run a spell check." Richard lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers out of my hand. I swiftly pulled them back out of his reach. I dropped the red pen onto the desk. "I am not signing your fake contract, Richard." My tone dropped an octave, slicing through the room like a razor blade. "I am not saving David. I am not bailing out your fraudulent financial empire." "The money is gone. You lying thief!" Patricia screamed, slamming her hands against her ears. "It is our money. Give it back." I opened the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy cardstock paper bearing the embossed logo of a major international wealth management bank. I slid the paper across the desk, stopping exactly in front of Richard. Look at the date. Richard glared at me, slowly lowering his eyes to the document. His breathing stopped completely. The $5.5 million did not go into a personal checking account. I explained, watching his face turn the color of ash. I did not keep a single dime for myself. The moment the sale cleared, the funds were instantly transferred into a blind, irrevocable corporate trust. Richard picked up the paper, his hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. The trust is legally locked. I continued, my voice utterly relentless. I cannot access the funds, and you cannot access the funds. A federal judge cannot access the funds. The money is locked away for 25 years. Patricia stared at him in complete horror. Tell me what it says right now. He dropped the paper onto the desk. You are officially out of time, and there is nothing left here. Richard stared at the heavy cardstock. His face was a mask of absolute defeat. He picked the document back up. His fingers were trembling slightly against the crisp white edges. He read the dense legal text aloud. His voice was a hollow rasp echoing in the silent office. He read the name of the irrevocable corporate trust. He read the 25-year maturation date. He read the names of the managing partners at the wealth management bank. These were men he knew intimately. These were men who played golf at his exclusive country club. These were men who sat on the same charity boards. These were men who would never break a federal trust agreement for a desperate and failing portfolio manager. The reality of his absolute powerlessness was settling deep into his bones. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and old and pathetic. I watched the realization crush him. The $5.5 million is entirely out of your reach, Richard, I said. My voice was calm and steady. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a hostile takeover attempt. The trust is impenetrable. It cannot be touched. It cannot be moved. It cannot be seized by any external entity. It certainly cannot be liquidated to bail out David and his fraudulent commercial bridge loan. The money is secure. It is legally bound. It is generating interest in a protected account that none of you will ever see. You wanted high-level corporate finance. I gave you high-level corporate finance. Patricia snatched the paper from Richard's hand. She scanned the bold print. Her eyes widened. Her perfectly manicured nails crumpled the edge of the document. The aggressive tyrant who had stormed into my office just minutes ago instantly vanished. She replaced the tyrant with a weeping victim. It was a terrifyingly fast transition. Tears spilled over her eyelashes. She dropped to her knees right there on the expensive carpet. She grabbed the edge of my mahogany desk with both hands. Audrey, please, Patricia cried. Her voice was a dramatic, wailing crescendo designed to elicit pity. You cannot do this to us. You are destroying your own family out of pure spite. You are holding a grudge over childhood slights. You are punishing us for trying to protect you. David is your brother. He made a mistake. He was under immense pressure. The market was shifting. He just needed a temporary asset to secure his position. If you do not reverse this trust, he will go to federal prison. His entire career will be over. His life will be ruined. I did not move. I looked down at her tear-streaked face. I felt absolutely nothing. You are forgetting Caroline, I reminded her softly. Patricia sobbed louder. Her shoulders shook with manufactured grief. You are destroying her marriage, she shrieked. David is going to lose everything, and he will drag Caroline down with him. They will lose their home. They will lose their social standing. They will be bankrupt. You are rendering your sister destitute because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of her perfect life. You have always hated her happiness. You are doing this to watch her suffer. You are a monster, Audrey. You are a cold and calculating monster. I stood up from my chair. I smoothed the skirt of my tailored suit. I walked around the desk and looked down at my mother. I am not destroying anything, Patricia, I said. David destroyed his own career the moment he committed wire fraud. David destroyed his marriage the moment he leveraged stolen property to cover his massive gambling debts on the tech market. Caroline destroyed her own happiness by marrying a man who builds his wealth on a foundation of lies and forgery. I simply removed the safety net. I simply stopped paying for the illusion. You all built a house of cards. I just opened the window and let the wind blow. You are facing the consequences of your own actions. Richard stood frozen. He looked at me as if he was seeing a ghost. He looked at the massive office. He looked at the luxury furniture. He looked at the security feed still playing on my secondary monitor. The bulldozer was currently tearing down the east wing of the cabin. The walls were collapsing. The dust was rising into the mountain air. The physical representation of their fake wealth was turning into rubble right before his eyes. His breathing was heavy and labored. Richard realized intimidation was completely useless. He realized emotional manipulation was completely useless. He realized that I was no longer the quiet, compliant daughter they could bully into submission. I was a fortress. I was a wall of solid ice. I had outmaneuvered them at every single turn. I had anticipated their threats. I had neutralized their leverage. I had trapped them in a prison of their own making. There was no escape hatch. There was no secret back door. There was only the brutal reality of their impending ruin. His eyes turned dark. The frantic desperation vanished. A cold, calculating malice settled over his features. He reached down and grabbed Patricia by the arm. He hauled her roughly to her feet. "Stop crying," he commanded. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper. "She is not going to give us the money. She has planned this for months. She has insulated herself completely." Patricia sniffled. She wiped her eyes violently. Her face was twisted with pure hatred. "What do we do?" she asked. "We are going to lose the fund. We are going to lose the house." Richard straightened his suit jacket. He glared at me with an intensity that would have terrified me 10 years ago. Now it bored me. He leaned close to Patricia's ear. He did not care that I could hear him. He wanted me to hear him. "Call the lawyer," Richard whispered. "We use the contingency plan." 48 hours passed in absolute silence. No phone calls, no text messages, no unhinged voicemails from Patricia. The silence was not a surrender. It was the deep inhale before a scream. I knew Richard was moving his pieces across the board. I simply waited for his next move. The attack came on a Thursday morning. It started with something entirely mundane. I walked into my usual coffee shop on my way to the corporate office. The air smelled of roasted espresso and burnt sugar. I ordered a black coffee and handed my personal debit card to the barista. He swiped the card through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp, flat tone of rejection. The barista frowned and tried the chip reader. The terminal flashed red. He looked up with an apologetic grimace and handed the card back across the counter. He told me it was declined. I felt a tiny prick of annoyance. I pulled out my secondary credit card. I handed it over. The machine beeped again. Declined. The barista offered a sympathetic smile. He suggested my bank might have flagged a suspicious transaction. I thanked him quietly and stepped out of the line. I walked out onto the bustling sidewalk without my coffee. The cold morning air hit my face as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my primary banking application. The screen loaded slowly. The moment the dashboard appeared, my heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs. A bright crimson banner spanned the top of my screen. My checking account was frozen. My personal savings account was frozen. My emergency liquid fund was completely inaccessible. I opened my secondary banking application. I saw the exact same crimson banner. Richard had not just blocked my cards. He had secured a court order to freeze every single asset associated with my personal social security number. He was trying to financially suffocate me. He was trying to cut off my oxygen so I would panic and unlock the corporate trust. I pocketed my phone and began the long walk back to my apartment. I could not even hail a cab. I kept my breathing steady. I refused to let the panic set in. I knew the $5.5 million from the Lake Tahoe sale was completely untouchable. The corporate trust was an iron fortress. Richard could not touch the trust. Therefore, he had decided to attack the only thing he could reach. He attacked my daily liquidity. He wanted me starving. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me crawling back to his mahogany desk, begging for access to my own grocery money. It was a classic aggressive corporate litigation tactic. You starve the opponent of resources until they cannot afford to fight you in court. I walked block after block. The noise of the city rushed past me. I mentally calculated the cash I had hidden in a small safe inside my apartment. I had enough physical currency to buy groceries and survive for exactly 3 months. I did not need to panic. I just needed to reach my apartment and contact my legal team. I turned the corner onto my street. The towering brick facade of my building came into view. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped out from the shadow of the heavy iron entrance doors. He had been waiting specifically for me. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered bad news for a living. He stepped directly into my path, blocking my way to the lobby. He looked at a small notepad in his hand, and then looked up at my face. He asked if I was Audrey Wilson. I did not bother denying it. I nodded once. He reached inside his oversized leather satchel. He pulled out a massive brick of legal documents. The stack of paper was easily 3 inches thick. It was bound by heavy rubber bands. He shoved the heavy brick directly against my chest. I reflexively brought my arms up to catch it. He told me I was officially served. He turned on his heel and walked rapidly down the street before I could say a single word. I carried the heavy stack of paper up to my apartment. I dropped the documents onto my kitchen island. The rubber bands snapped loudly as I pulled them off. I spread the papers out across the cool marble counter. The header of the first document jumped out at me. It was an emergency injunction and a civil lawsuit filed in federal court. The plaintiffs were Richard and David. They were suing me for multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. They were demanding the immediate return of the $5.5 million plus an additional $2 million in punitive damages and legal fees. They accused me of malicious financial sabotage. I flipped through the dense legal jargon. My eyes scanned the paragraphs of aggressive accusations. They painted me as a greedy, unstable relative who had illegally liquidated a family asset. I reached the back of the stack. I found the appendix containing the exhibits. I pulled out the document labeled Exhibit A. I stared at the single piece of paper. The air in my apartment suddenly felt impossibly thin. It was a formal power of attorney. The document was dated exactly 10 years ago. It was signed by Grandfather Theodore. The signature looked absolutely flawless. The document explicitly granted Richard absolute and irrevocable control over the Lake Tahoe property. According to this piece of paper, Theodore had transferred all decision-making power regarding the real estate directly to Richard, just days before he secretly handed me the deed. The implication was legally devastating. If this document was accepted by a judge, my deed was entirely worthless. I had sold property that legally belonged under Richard's jurisdiction. The lawsuit framed me as a common thief who had bypassed the rightful legal executor to steal millions. Richard had forged the ultimate weapon. I stared at the heavy cream paper resting on my kitchen island. The fluorescent light from the overhead fixture cast a harsh, blinding glare across the thick, black ink. Grandfather Theodore's signature sat perfectly on the bottom line. I leaned closer, resting my hands flat against the cold marble counter. The signature was a true masterpiece. It possessed the exact sweeping loops of his capital T. It had the slight hesitation in the middle of the H, where his arthritis always made his hand catch. It even captured the aggressive downward slant of his final E. Richard had not just scribbled a clumsy name. He had hired a professional. He had spent serious money to recreate the physical impression of a dead man. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I realized exactly how far my father was willing to go. He was not just trying to bully me anymore. He was actively trying to destroy my freedom. He had crossed the line from corporate manipulation into felony fabrication. He was willing to perjure himself in federal court to save his fraudulent empire. The sheer weight of the lawsuit pressed down on my chest. I pushed myself away from the island and paced across the dark hardwood floor. My breathing grew shallow and ragged. If a federal judge looked at this document and deemed it authentic, I was entirely finished. The legal implications cascaded through my mind like falling dominoes. The transfer of the Lake Tahoe deed would be immediately classified as grand larceny. The subsequent sale to the shell company would trigger massive wire fraud charges. The creation of the irrevocable trust would be viewed as an illegal attempt to hide stolen assets. I would not just lose my license to practice corporate finance. I would be indicted by the Department of Justice. I pictured the cold metal of handcuffs snapping shut around my wrists. I imagined the sterile walls of a federal holding cell closing in on me. Richard and David had cornered me. They had frozen every single dollar to my name so I could not hire a defense attorney. They had manufactured a fraudulent document that stripped away my only legal defense. They were going to let me take the absolute fall for their collapsing financial schemes. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt like they were inching inward. The high ceilings seemed lower. The expansive view of the city skyline offered no comfort whatsoever. I was completely isolated. They had planned this aggressive strike with terrifying precision. They knew my grandfather had executed multiple private documents before his sudden death. They knew a judge would find a delayed power of attorney plausible. I walked back to the kitchen counter. I needed a cold glass of water, but my hands were shaking too much to hold a glass. I stared at the paper again. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. I forced myself to stop trembling. Panic is a useless emotion in a crisis. Panic makes you blind and vulnerable. I closed my eyes and took 3 slow, deep breaths. I channeled the exact same cold focus I used when auditing hostile corporate acquisitions. I opened my eyes and looked at the document not as a threat, but as a raw piece of data. Every single piece of data has a flaw. I pulled out my reading glasses and bent over the paper. I ignored the signature entirely. If the forgery was professional, staring at the ink would yield absolutely nothing. I shifted my focus to the surrounding visual elements. I checked the margins. I checked the font kerning. I examined the standard legal boilerplate text. Everything appeared perfectly aligned with standard legal practices from 10 years ago. Then my eyes dropped to the bottom left corner of the crisp page. The notary seal. It was a standard embossed stamp pressed firmly into the heavy paper. A faint circle of blue ink overlay the embossing. The notary public's signature slashed aggressively across the seal. I leaned so close my nose almost touched the paper. I inspected the tiny text circling the outer edge of the notary seal. It listed the state of registration. It listed the notary identification number. It listed the commission expiration date. I read the date once. I read it a second time. My heart stopped. I ran down the hall to my home office. I pulled open the heavy bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I retrieved a thick leather binder containing all of Theodore's authentic estate documents. I flipped frantically through the heavy pages. I found an original authentic document signed and notarized during the exact same week 10 years ago. I carried it back to the kitchen and placed it directly beside Richard's forged masterpiece. I compared the 2 notary seals. The authentic document bore the seal of Marcus Vance. The forged document also bore the seal of Marcus Vance, but the details were fatally mismatched. Notary commissions must be renewed every 4 years. The forged document claimed to be executed 10 years ago. However, the commission expiration date stamped on Richard's forgery was only 3 years old. Richard applied a recent stamp to a backdated document. He had not just forged a dead man's signature, he had falsified a federal notary seal. He submitted a fabricated document into the federal court record. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance and stupidity washed over me. The suffocating panic instantly evaporated into the thin air. The walls of my apartment receded. A sharp, triumphant smile broke across my face. Richard had tried to build a flawless trap, but he had handed me the detonator. I reached for my cell phone resting on the marble counter. I dialed a highly encrypted private number. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. I did not bother with polite pleasantries. My voice was pure cold steel. They took the bait, I said. Prepare the legal filings. I hung up the phone and grabbed my coat. The frozen bank accounts and the massive stack of fraudulent legal documents sitting on my kitchen island were no longer a source of panic. They were the exact leverage I needed. I left my apartment, and walked 3 blocks east to avoid private investigators. I slipped into a hotel parking garage and took the service elevator to the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal a pristine corridor. This was the covert satellite office of Vanguard Legal Solutions. They were a boutique corporate litigation firm that specialized in destroying hostile acquisitions and white-collar fraud. I did not use the attorneys my family knew. I used the attorneys my family feared. I pushed open the glass doors to the main boardroom. A massive slab of black marble served as the conference table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the financial district. 3 people were already waiting for me. Marcus Vance was the lead litigator. He was a former federal prosecutor with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. Beside him sat Elena Rostova. She was the firm's top forensic accountant. A junior associate sat rapidly typing on a silver laptop. Marcus stood up and buttoned his tailored suit jacket. He gestured to the empty black leather chair at the head of the table. "They moved exactly as you predicted, Audrey," Marcus said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone. "Richard filed the emergency injunction yesterday afternoon. The federal judge granted the temporary asset freeze based on the power of attorney document. We received the digital filings 10 minutes ago." I took my seat and placed my encrypted tablet onto the black marble. "Did you review the notary stamp on Exhibit A?" I asked. Elena slid a glossy, high-resolution printout across the table. It was an enlarged image of the forged power of attorney. She had circled the notary seal with a bright red marker. "It is a spectacular, unforced error," she stated flatly. "The document is dated 10 years ago. The notary commission number belongs to a man named Arthur Pendleton. We checked the state registry. Pendleton did not receive his notary commission until 3 years ago. It is a physical impossibility for that stamp to exist on a 10-year-old document. Richard bought a high-quality forgery, but he failed to verify the historical continuity of the notary seal." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "This constitutes federal perjury," he explained. "Submitting a known forged document to secure a federal injunction is a felony. We can file an immediate motion to quash the injunction. I can have a judge review this discrepancy in chambers by tomorrow morning. The judge will lift the freeze on your assets and dismiss their lawsuit with prejudice. We can end this quietly." I looked at the red circle on the glossy paper. I thought about Richard slamming his hands on my desk. I thought about Patricia screaming that I was a monster. I thought about David leveraging our family name to cover his illegal gambling debts. Ending this quietly was the absolute last thing I wanted to do. "No," I said. My voice sliced through the quiet boardroom. "We are not doing this quietly in a judge's chambers. If we dismiss the case now, they will just regroup and find another angle of attack. I want to crush them completely. I want to salt the earth so nothing can ever grow back." Marcus raised an eyebrow. He looked intrigued. "What are your instructions?" "I want to fast-track the preliminary hearing," I instructed. "Do not file the motion to quash. Let them believe the asset freeze is holding. Let them believe they have me cornered and desperate. I want a full preliminary hearing in open federal court. I want Richard on the witness stand. I want David on the witness stand. I want them to swear under oath that the power of attorney is authentic." Elena tapped her pen against her notepad. "You want to let them commit perjury in open court before you spring the trap." "Exactly," I replied. "If we show the judge the forgery now, it is just a dismissed lawsuit. If we let them testify to its authenticity under oath, it becomes a direct criminal conspiracy. I want subpoenas issued immediately. Subpoena Richard. Subpoena David. Subpoena Patricia. Subpoena the notary public. Subpoena every single bank record connecting David to that commercial bridge loan. Bring everything into the light." Marcus smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. "It is a bold strategy, Audrey. You will have to live with frozen accounts for another 2 weeks while we get on the docket. They will use that time to publicly drag your name through the mud." "I do not care about the mud," I said. "I care about the end game. Draft the subpoenas. File the response acknowledging the hearing date. Do not show our hand. Let them walk right into the courtroom thinking they have already won." I stood up. "Prepare the filings, Marcus." I walked out of the boardroom. The glass doors sealed shut behind me. Stepping into the elevator, I felt a strange sense of absolute calm. I was no longer reacting to their attacks. I was directing their execution. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was David. He had been completely silent for weeks, hiding behind Richard's aggressive legal maneuvers. Now that the asset freeze was in place, he suddenly felt brave enough to reach out. I slowly opened the message. The text was short and dripping with arrogant confidence. He wrote, "Should have just given us the money. See you in court, little sweetheart." I stared silently at the glowing words on the screen. A cold, dark smile touched the corners of my mouth. He had absolutely no idea what kind of destruction was coming for him. 14 days later, the heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse loomed ahead of me. The morning air was bitterly cold, biting through the thin wool of my tailored black coat. I did not shiver. I felt perfectly, entirely calm. Marcus Vance walked on my right side. Elena Rostova walked on my left. We moved together in absolute synchronicity, moving up the wide granite steps like a disciplined tactical unit. My accounts had been frozen for exactly 2 weeks. For 14 days, I had lived off the cash in my safe. For 14 days, I had ignored the barrage of threatening legal letters and the aggressive voicemails left by my family. I had simply waited for this exact moment. We passed through the strict security checkpoint and entered the grand, echoing expanse of the main judicial hallway. The floors were polished white marble. The vaulted ceilings were painted with intricate murals of blind justice. I spotted them immediately. My family had arranged themselves at the far end of the corridor outside the assigned courtroom. They looked like absolute royalty holding court in their own private kingdom. They exuded a toxic, arrogant wealth. David stood in the center of the group. He was wearing a dark charcoal bespoke suit that likely cost more than my first car. His hair was perfectly styled. His posture was rigidly straight. He looked nothing like a man facing imminent financial ruin and federal wire fraud charges. Richard stood beside him wearing his signature intimidation scowl. Patricia was draped in beige cashmere, clutching a designer handbag tightly against her chest. They were surrounded by a swarm of junior legal associates holding leather briefcases. As we approached their group, a man detached himself from the swarm and stepped directly into my path. He was David's lead counsel. He was a tall, overly tanned man wearing a flashy platinum watch and a custom silk tie. He radiated an aggressive, sleazy confidence. He did not bother addressing Marcus or Elena. He looked down his nose directly at me. He stopped mere inches from my face, attempting to use his physical size to bully me right there in the hallway. "You are completely out of your depth here, Audrey," the lawyer sneered. His voice was a harsh, abrasive rasp, designed to echo off the marble walls and humiliate me in front of the gathering crowd. "I do not care what boutique firm you hired to hold your hand today. Vanguard Legal Solutions cannot save you from the reality of this situation. We hold the authentic, notarized legal authority. We have the paper trail. We have the grandfather's explicit instructions. You are a rogue actor who illegally liquidated assets that did not belong to you. You stole from your own family to line your pockets. I am giving you one final chance to be smart about this. If you authorize the immediate release of the corporate trust right now, I will advise my clients to drop the criminal referrals. If you force us to walk through those oak doors, I will personally ensure you leave this building in handcuffs." Marcus Vance let out a low, terrifying chuckle. He did not say a single word. He simply smiled at the flashy lawyer with the quiet, predatory amusement of a shark watching a mouse swim into its open mouth. I did not acknowledge the lawyer either. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my family. Patricia broke away from Richard and marched toward me. Her face was twisted into a mask of absolute revulsion. She looked at me as if I was something foul she had scraped off the bottom of her expensive Italian shoes. The aristocratic facade she usually maintained was completely gone. "We pitied you, Audrey," Patricia hissed. Her voice was trembling with manufactured dramatic rage. "We pitied you for years." We took you in. We gave you a place at our table. We tolerated your strange, quiet behavior. We tried to make you a part of our beautiful family. We tried to protect you from your own pathetic mediocrity. And this is exactly how you repay us. You turn around and stab your own brother in the back. You try to steal the legacy that Richard spent decades building. You are a vile, ungrateful thief. You are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are absolutely dead to this family. I looked at my mother. I looked at the hateful lines etched into her face. I felt absolutely nothing. No pain, no sorrow, no regret. The invisible thread that had kept me desperately seeking her approval for 34 years was finally completely severed. "I hope you remember saying that, Patricia," I replied. My voice was a flat, emotionless whisper that cut through the noise of the hallway. "I hope you remember every single word." The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open. A stern federal bailiff stepped out and announced that the judge was ready for the preliminary hearing. The tense standoff in the hallway immediately dissolved as both legal teams filed into the room. The courtroom was an imposing chamber of dark mahogany and deep green leather. I sat at the defendant's table with Marcus and Elena. I folded my hands neatly in my lap. I looked across the center aisle. David was sitting at the plaintiff's table. He caught my eye. He gave me a slow, arrogant wink. He actually thought he had won. He actually believed he was going to walk out of this room $5.5 million richer. The side door behind the bench opened. The federal judge entered the courtroom. He was a strict, severely frowning man with decades of experience crushing white-collar criminals. The entire room stood in silent respect. The judge took his seat. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Let us get exactly to the point," the judge growled, leaning forward and glaring over his reading glasses. "I have an emergency injunction blocking millions of dollars. I want to know why this is taking up my docket. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed." David's flashy lawyer immediately leaped to his feet. He buttoned his suit jacket with a dramatic flourish. He grabbed a thick legal folder from the table and marched aggressively toward the center podium. "Your Honor, we are here today because the defendant, Audrey Wilson, has committed an egregious and malicious act of multi-million-dollar wire fraud." The lawyer bellowed. His voice filled the entire courtroom. "She exploited a sick elderly man to execute a fraudulent real estate transfer. She then illegally liquidated the property and hid the stolen funds in a locked corporate trust. However, Your Honor, we possess the definitive proof of her crime." The lawyer dramatically pulled the forged document from his folder and held it up high for the judge to see. "We hold the original notarized power of attorney executed by Theodore Wilson. This document grants my client, Richard Wilson, absolute and total jurisdiction over the property in question. The defendant knew she had no legal right to sell. She is a thief, Your Honor. We are respectfully demanding that this court uphold the asset freeze, immediately invalidate the corporate trust, and remand Audrey Wilson into federal custody today for severe elder abuse and massive financial fraud." The echoes of the flashy lawyer's demands hung in the heavy courtroom. He stood at the podium with his chest puffed out and a smug sneer directed at my table. He actually expected the federal judge to signal the bailiff and have me dragged away in handcuffs. The judge peered over his wire-rimmed glasses, looking unimpressed. "Counsel for the defense," the judge rumbled. "Your response to these severe allegations." Marcus Vance stood up slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate precision. He did not carry a thick folder. He did not bring a stack of case law. He held only a small silver flash drive between his thumb and index finger. He walked to the podium and placed the tiny device on the polished wood. "Your Honor, we do not intend to waste the court's time debating the authenticity of the plaintiff's fabricated document," Marcus said. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone. "We will not argue about margins or kerning or the fact that the notary seal belongs to a commission issued only 3 years ago." A sharp gasp erupted from the plaintiff's table. I watched David's flashy lawyer recoil. He snatched his copy of the power of attorney and stared frantically at the notary stamp. The arrogant color instantly drained from his face. Richard and David exchanged panicked glances. However, Your Honor, Marcus continued, ignoring the panic spreading across the aisle. We believe visual evidence is far more compelling than forensic ink analysis. We request permission to submit Defense Exhibit A and play a short video file for the court. The judge narrowed his eyes and nodded. Permission granted. The court clerk will assist with the audiovisual equipment. The clerk wheeled a high-definition monitor to the center of the courtroom and connected the silver flash drive. The screen flickered to life. The entire courtroom fell completely dead silent. Even Patricia stopped clutching her designer handbag. The video quality was clear. It showed the interior of Grandfather Theodore's private study. Theodore sat behind his massive oak desk. He looked robust, sharp, and in command. Beside him sat his estate attorney, who held a stack of legal documents. Theodore looked directly into the camera lens. His piercing blue eyes were full of relentless clarity. "My name is Theodore Wilson," he stated in a firm, unwavering voice. "Today is October 14th. I am recording this statement to prevent the exact parasitic behavior I know my son Richard will attempt upon my passing. I am of sound mind and absolute resolve." I watched Richard grip the edge of the plaintiff's table. His knuckles turned stark white. David looked like he was going to be physically sick. For the past 5 years, I have watched Richard destroy family legacy. He is a gambling addict. He has leveraged properties without my consent to pay off his illicit obligations. His son David is cut from the same cloth, displaying nothing but arrogance and financial incompetence. I would rather burn my empire to the ground than hand them the matches. A collective shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge leaned forward, resting his chin on folded hands. His gaze flicked from the monitor directly to Richard. "Therefore, I am executing an irrevocable transfer of commercial assets. I am signing these deeds over to my granddaughter, Audrey Wilson. She is the only person in this family who possesses the integrity and the spine required to protect what I have built. I explicitly deny Richard Wilson any power of attorney over my estate." On the screen, Theodore picked up his gold fountain pen. The camera zoomed in slightly as he signed his name across the bottom of the authentic deed. The notary public stepped into the frame and applied his seal. The video faded to black. The silence in the federal courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The air felt heavy with the sheer magnitude of the destruction that had just been unleashed. Marcus Vance walked back to our table and sat down. He folded his hands perfectly in his lap. "The defense rests, Your Honor," he said quietly. David's flashy lawyer was sweating profusely. He was shoving papers into his leather briefcase. He was desperately trying to distance himself from his own clients. Richard sat frozen. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Patricia was staring at the blank monitor with a look of horrified realization. The judge slowly picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He did not look angry. He looked absolutely lethal. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he turned his dark, furious glare directly toward the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Wilson." The judge's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years. I have seen every variety of corporate malfeasance. But the staggering audacity required to walk into my courtroom and submit a clumsy, blatant forgery to secure a federal injunction is truly unprecedented." Richard tried to stand up. "Your Honor, I can explain. We were unaware." "Sit down immediately." The judge roared. The command hit the room like a physical shockwave. Richard collapsed back into his chair, trembling. "Your submitted power of attorney is hereby declared a fraudulent document," the judge stated, his voice slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. "I am immediately lifting the asset freeze placed upon Audrey Wilson. I am dismissing your ridiculous lawsuit with prejudice. But we are far from finished. You do not get to use the federal courts to execute your family vendettas." The judge signaled to the federal marshals standing near the heavy oak doors. They immediately stepped forward, resting their hands on their utility belts. "Richard and David Wilson," the judge announced. His eyes locked onto them with unwavering intensity. "I am referring this matter to the prosecutor. You are now facing federal felony charges for perjury and wire fraud. You will remain seated while the marshals take you into custody. Two federal marshals stepped past the wooden gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. Their boots echoed loudly. They reached the plaintiff's table and unclipped handcuffs from their belts. Richard slumped forward against the mahogany table face buried in trembling hands. David shot up from his chair. His bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big on his shrinking frame. He backed away from the marshals with his hands raised in surrender, bumping hard against the railing. He looked wildly at his expensive attorney. "Do something!" David shrieked, his voice a panicked pitch shattering his manicured facade. "You promised me this was bulletproof. Fix this right now." The flashy lawyer was already back at the center podium. His deep tan faded to a sickly yellow hue. His platinum watch clanked loudly against the wood as he gripped the edges of the stand. He was breathing heavily. The terror of facing a furious federal judge who had just witnessed a blatant perjury attempt radiated off his sweating forehead. He had to pivot immediately to save his clients from being marched out in chains and save his own legal license. "Your Honor, please halt the marshals," the lawyer pleaded, his abrasive rasp now a desperate whine. "I beg the court for a momentary stay of execution regarding the custody order. I concede the overwhelming nature of the video evidence presented by the defense. We were completely unaware of that recording. However, the defense deliberately obscured the timeline of subsequent events to mask my client's severe financial damages. Even if we accept the deed legitimately belonged to Audrey Wilson, her subsequent actions constitute a calculated, malicious campaign of financial sabotage directed at David Wilson. She is not an innocent victim. She is a corporate predator." The judge raised his hand. The marshals paused their advance but remained standing mere inches from Richard and David. The judge glared at the sweating attorney. "You are walking on exceptionally thin ice, counselor," the judge warned, his voice cold and sharp. "You just submitted a forged federal document to my court. Now you want to allege malicious sabotage against the rightful property owner. Make your argument quickly. If you waste another minute of my time, I will hold you in contempt and put you in a cell right next to your clients." The lawyer swallowed hard and frantically flipped through his legal pads. "Your Honor, 5 weeks ago, David Wilson finalized a multi-million-dollar charity fundraising gala to be held on that exact Lake Tahoe property. It was the centerpiece of his firm's philanthropic initiative. International investors were secured. Massive media contracts were signed. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits were paid." Audrey Wilson knew all of this. She knew the gala was critical to David's corporate survival. Instead of notifying him of her ownership dispute, she maliciously and secretly sold the entire estate to a ruthless corporate conglomerate known as Apex Group. The lawyer pointed an accusing finger directly at me. His confidence was returning slightly as he spun his desperate narrative. "She sold the property to Apex Group for pennies on the dollar," the lawyer shouted. Apex Group immediately issued cease and desist orders to David's firm. They canceled the gala contracts. They locked the gates. They deliberately caused massive, catastrophic financial damages to David Wilson. She weaponized that deed. She handed the property over to an anonymous hostile corporation simply to watch her brother fail. This was an act of tortious interference and severe financial sabotage. The court must freeze the Apex Group transaction and investigate her collusion with that shadow corporation. Marcus Vance did not even bother to stand up. He simply looked at me and nodded. It was my turn to deliver the final strike. I stood up from the defendant's table. I smoothed the front of my black wool coat. I did not look at David. I did not look at Richard. I did not look at the screaming lawyer. I walked calmly toward the center of the courtroom. I bypassed the podium entirely and approached the wooden gate separating the well from the judge's elevated bench. I held a single crisp manila folder in my right hand. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" I asked respectfully. The judge nodded. "You may." I walked forward and handed the manila folder to the court clerk. The clerk immediately passed it up to the judge. The judge opened the folder and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the documents. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. The opposing counsel is absolutely correct about one specific fact. Your Honor, I stated clearly. My voice was steady and carried effortlessly to the back of the silent room. I did sell the Lake Tahoe property to Apex Group. I executed that sale precisely 48 hours before David Wilson attempted to illegally collateralize the estate for his personal debts. The transfer was completely legal. The taxes were paid. The deed was secured under a corporate shelter. The flashy lawyer slammed his hand on the podium. "You see, Your Honor," he yelled triumphantly. "She admits to the malicious sale. She sold it to a shadow corporation to ruin my client." I turned my head slowly and looked the lawyer directly in his eyes. "I did not sell the property to a shadow corporation," I replied softly. "I did not sell the property to strangers." I turned back to the judge. The judge was reading the final page of the document. A slow, grim smile began to form on his lips. He looked over his glasses at the plaintiff's table with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Your Honor, you are holding the official certified articles of incorporation for Apex Group I announced to the courtroom. I registered the company 3 years ago. I am the sole chief executive officer and 100% shareholder. I simply sold the massive estate directly to myself. They are finally finished." The federal judge stared at the crisp pages of the Articles of Incorporation. The thick silence in the courtroom was absolute. The flashy lawyer stood frozen at the podium. His mouth hung slightly open. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire legal career evaporate into thin air. David sank lower into his heavy wooden chair. His custom charcoal suit suddenly looked wrinkled and cheap. Richard remained paralyzed with his face buried in his trembling hands. The staggering weight of their own arrogance had finally crushed them. I turned my attention back to the judge. I kept my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional inflection. Apex Group is a privately held corporate entity. I explained clearly. I established it 3 years ago as a defensive holding company. I utilized the initial seed capital my grandfather legally transferred to my private accounts before his sudden passing. The sale of the Lake Tahoe estate was an internal transaction. I transferred the physical property from my personal portfolio directly into my own corporate shelter. It was a flawless, standard corporate restructuring maneuver. It triggered no external liabilities. It violated no federal statutes. The taxes were filed correctly and paid in full. I did not sell out my family legacy. I secured it behind an impenetrable wall of corporate sovereignty. The flashy lawyer sputtered and gripped the edges of the podium. "But the cease and desist orders." He choked out, his voice reduced to a frantic squeak. "You canceled the gala contracts. You locked the gates. You intentionally destroyed David's philanthropic initiative." I turned my gaze toward him. My eyes were cold and unyielding. "I exercised my absolute legal right as the sole proprietor of Apex Group to terminate unauthorized access to my private property," I stated flatly. David Wilson attempted to use an estate he did not own to secure massive international investments. He sold access to my land to cover his personal leverage. I simply shut the gates. I am not legally obligated to subsidize his fraudulent corporate ventures. I looked back at the judge. The judge was listening with sharp, predatory interest. He folded his hands and nodded for me to continue. "The internal corporate transfer was a legal tax maneuver, Your Honor," I said smoothly. "But more importantly, it was a deliberate and calculated stress test. I knew exactly what my brother and my father were doing. I knew they had heavily leveraged their own assets. I knew David was drowning in illegal gambling debts and hidden corporate liabilities. I knew they were desperate for a massive influx of untraceable cash. The Lake Tahoe estate was their only remaining lifeline. They needed that property to survive their upcoming margin calls." I took a slow breath and let the reality of the situation settle over the courtroom. I knew that the absolute second the property appeared to be sold to an anonymous, ruthless conglomerate, they would experience total financial panic. I explained. I knew they would realize their illicit collateral was gone. I knew they would become desperate enough to take drastic illegal measures to claw the money back. I intentionally triggered their panic. I created the exact conditions that forced them to reveal their true nature. I simply provided the illusion of a corporate takeover and then stepped back to watch them destroy themselves. They forged a federal document. They committed perjury in open court. They did all of this simply because they thought they could bully their way out of the consequences of their own spectacular financial incompetence. The courtroom remained paralyzed. The sheer mathematical precision of the trap left the gallery completely speechless. I had not just beaten them in a legal skirmish. I had engineered a scenario where they willingly handed the federal government the exact evidence required to send them to prison. Suddenly, a piercing shriek shattered the heavy silence. "You are a psychopath." A woman screamed from the second row of the gallery. It was Caroline. She was David's wife. Her face was contorted with absolute fury. She stood up and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "You are a cold, calculated monster, Audrey. You planned this entire thing just to ruin us. You set your own family up to fail. You are sick." The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with terrifying force. "Order in this court," he roared. "Bailiff, remove that woman from the gallery immediately. If she resists, you will hold her in contempt and place her in a holding cell." Two federal marshals instantly moved toward Caroline. They grabbed her arms and physically dragged her toward the heavy double doors. She continued screaming and thrashing, but her protests were quickly muffled as the thick oak doors slammed shut behind her. The courtroom fell back into a stunned, suffocating silence. I did not even blink. I did not turn around to watch her leave. I simply let the echoes of her desperate screaming fade away into the high vaulted ceiling. Caroline was merely collateral damage in a war she had willingly participated in. She had happily spent the stolen money. She had no right to complain when the bill finally came due. I turned my attention entirely away from the gallery. I dismissed the flashy lawyer. I ignored Richard, who was still sobbing quietly at the plaintiff's table. I focused my gaze solely on David. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The arrogant smirk he had worn in the hallway was completely gone. He looked small, weak, and entirely broken. But I was not finished. The forged power of attorney was only the beginning. The trap I had built for him was much deeper and far more destructive than a simple real estate dispute. I walked slowly toward the plaintiff's table. I stopped right in front of David. I looked down at him with absolute clinical detachment. "Did you really think the Lake Tahoe estate was the only family asset I audited, David?" David stared up at me with a hollow, vacant expression. The arrogant veneer that defined his personality had completely melted away. He looked wildly around the courtroom, searching for a lifeline. His flashy lawyer was busy packing his leather briefcase, shoving documents inside with frantic movements, focused entirely on saving himself. David was entirely alone. "You are bluffing, Audrey," David finally managed to whisper. "You do not have access to my private corporate accounts." "I did not need access to your private accounts, David," I replied. "I only needed access to the public ledgers and the trail of financial wreckage you left behind." Marcus Vance stepped forward. He walked to the clerk and handed over a massive black leather binder. The clerk passed the heavy binder to the judge. The judge opened the cover and began to read. The silence in the room stretched out. "What exactly am I looking at, counselor?" the judge finally asked. His voice was dangerously quiet. "You are looking at the anatomical structure of a massive federal crime, Your Honor," Marcus replied smoothly. "You are looking at David Wilson's primary investment fund. For the past 4 years, David has presented himself as a visionary venture capitalist. He actively solicited millions of dollars from high-net-worth individuals, promising them guaranteed double-digit returns. He claimed he was investing their capital in emerging technology sectors and lucrative commercial real estate developments." The judge flipped another page, his eyes narrowing. "And I presume he was not." "He was not, Your Honor," Marcus stated flatly. "The documents in that binder trace every single dollar David Wilson collected. He never invested a dime. He took the capital from new investors and used it to pay the guaranteed returns to his older investors. He used the remaining funds to finance his own lavish lifestyle, his luxury vehicles, his gambling debts, and his attempts to maintain the illusion of wealth. He has been operating a textbook Ponzi scheme right under the noses of federal regulators." David bolted upright in his chair. "That is a complete lie," he screamed, his voice cracking in panic. "That is fabricated evidence. My fund is entirely legitimate. She manufactured those documents to destroy me." "Sit down, Mr. Wilson," the judge commanded without looking up from the binder. "If you speak out of turn again, I will have you gagged." David collapsed back into his chair, hyperventilating. The financial hole in David's fraudulent fund reached a critical breaking point 3 months ago, I said, taking over the narrative. I kept my eyes locked on David, watching him squirm under the crushing weight of the truth. He owed his primary investors $12 million. He had absolutely zero liquid capital left. The auditors were demanding proof of collateral. He was completely trapped. He needed a massive hard asset to pledge against the missing millions, or the entire house of cards was going to collapse. "That is why he targeted the Lake Tahoe estate," Marcus added. "He knew it was the most valuable unencumbered property in the family portfolio. He colluded with his father to forge the power of attorney so he could use the estate as fraudulent collateral. They planned to leverage the property, secure a massive emergency loan, pay off the angry investors, and keep the Ponzi scheme running for another year. They were willing to steal Audrey's inheritance to cover up a spectacular federal crime. The judge slowly closed the heavy black binder. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at David with an expression of profound disgust. "You attempted to use this court to validate a forged document so you could perpetuate a multi-million-dollar fraud," the judge stated, his voice laced with cold fury. "You sought an injunction to steal a property to cover up a Ponzi scheme. The sheer staggering arrogance of your actions is difficult to comprehend." Richard lifted his head from the table. He looked at his son with an expression of pure horror. "He had been willing to forge a document to steal my property, but he clearly had no idea the depths of David's criminal enterprise." "You lied to me," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "You told me the fund was experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis. You told me you just needed a bridge loan. You never told me you were running a fraud." David ignored his father. He glared at me with pure venomous hatred. "You think you have won, Audrey?" he spat. "You think bringing this binder to a family court dispute is going to save you? This judge cannot prosecute me for financial crimes. This is a civil injunction hearing. You are out of your jurisdiction." I smiled. It was a cold smile that held absolutely no warmth. "You are entirely correct, David," I said softly. "This judge cannot prosecute you for running a Ponzi scheme. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation when you decided to use my name and my property in your fraudulent collateral claims." I stepped closer to the plaintiff's table. "You forgot that I am not just your sister," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am a licensed commercial real estate broker. I hold a fiduciary duty and a strict legal obligation under federal law. When I audited the estate and discovered you had attempted to pledge the Lake Tahoe property as collateral for your fraudulent fund, I did not just print out a binder for this civil hearing. I was legally required to report suspicious collateral claims to the proper authorities." David's face drained of all remaining color. He stared at me in absolute paralyzed terror. "I did not just bring this evidence to family court, David. I delivered the final devastating blow. I handed the entire unredacted financial audit directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission exactly 72 hours ago. They are currently executing search warrants at your corporate headquarters right now." The silence following my declaration hung in the air for only a fraction of a second. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding crash. The sharp sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. 3 men walked through the doors. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency. 2 of them wore dark-tailored suits with subtle SEC badges clipped to their lapels. The man leading them wore a tactical windbreaker with the bold yellow letters FBI printed across the back. They bypassed the wooden gallery benches and marched directly toward the well of the court. The 2 federal marshals who had been strictly guarding the perimeter immediately stepped back to grant them unimpeded access. The judge did not bang his gavel. He simply sat back in his high leather chair and watched the federal agents approach the bench. He looked entirely unsurprised. The lead FBI agent reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded documents. He handed the papers directly to the court clerk. The clerk passed them up to the judge. The judge glanced at the top sheet and gave a slow, deliberate nod. David Wilson watched this silent exchange with absolute terror. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The bespoke charcoal suit that he wore like armor suddenly looked like a cheap costume. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He backed away from the plaintiff table until his spine hit the wooden railing. He looked like a trapped animal cornered by apex predators. "It was not me!" David shrieked. His voice cracked into a high-pitched, frantic squeal. The sound bounced off the cold marble walls. "I am just the public face of the fund. I did not handle the internal ledgers. My partners structured the payouts. They managed the offshore accounts. You need to look at them. I am completely innocent. I did not authorize any fraudulent wire transfers. I swear I had no idea they were moving capital illegally." The FBI agent did not even blink. He simply continued walking toward David, holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. David scrambled sideways along the railing, trying to find an exit that did not exist. His eyes darted wildly around the room. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his father. "Richard did this." David screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "He told me to use the property. He managed the leverage. He forced me into the collateral agreements because he needed cash to cover his own gambling debts. I was just following his instructions. Ask him. Arrest him. He is the one who set up the shell companies. He forged the power of attorney. I had nothing to do with it. He manipulated me." Richard stared at his son in absolute horrified disbelief. The father who had indulged David his entire life, who had helped him forge a federal document to steal my inheritance, was now being thrown directly under the bus. Richard clutched his chest. His mouth opened in a silent scream of ultimate betrayal. He slumped forward against the table, unable to process the sheer cowardice of his own child. Patricia sat paralyzed in the front row of the gallery. Her hands hovered over her mouth. Her perfect aristocratic facade shattered into a mask of pure devastation. She could not comprehend that her golden child was actively trying to send his own father to federal prison to save himself. The polished illusion of her pristine family was burning to the ground right before her eyes. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open again. Caroline shoved her way past the distracted marshals. She must have seen the federal agents marching through the hallway and followed them inside. She ran down the center aisle, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You cannot do this!" she wailed, frantically grabbing at the air. "He is a prominent investment banker. We have a charity gala next week. You are ruining our reputation. We belong to the country club. Do you know who we are? You are making a massive mistake. My husband is an important man." The SEC agent stepped smoothly into her path. They blocked her from reaching the plaintiff table. Caroline collapsed against the wooden gate, sobbing hysterically. Her designer makeup ran down her face in dark, jagged streaks. She beat her fists against the solid wooden gate, demanding that the agents let her husband go. She shrieked my name, calling me a monster, but her words were completely ignored. The lead FBI agent stopped directly in front of David. He grabbed David by the shoulder and spun him around. He slammed David face first against the polished wood of the plaintiff table. David let out a pathetic, whimpering cry as his cheek hit the hard surface. The papers on the table scattered everywhere. "David Wilson, you are under arrest for multi-million-dollar wire fraud, embezzlement, and the operation of an illegal financial enterprise," the lead federal agent stated in a loud and booming voice. The heavy handcuffs clicked around David's wrists with a sharp metallic snap. The sound signaled the absolute end of his pathetic empire. The agent continued speaking, reading David his Miranda rights as he yanked him back upright. David was openly weeping. His knees buckled, and the agent had to physically hold him up by the back of his expensive suit jacket. His arrogant demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic reality of a broken, desperate criminal facing decades behind bars. I stood silently at the defense table and watched the entire scene unfold. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of their endless greed play out exactly as I had planned. The financial trap had sprung shut. I had successfully protected my grandfather's legacy and permanently eliminated the greedy parasites. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind the federal agents as they dragged David into the corridor. His expensive Italian leather shoes scraped against the polished marble floor. The sharp metallic clinking of the handcuffs echoed down the hallway. I walked past the plaintiff table. Richard was still slumped over the polished wood, clutching his chest and gasping for air. Patricia knelt beside him, her perfect silk blouse wrinkled and stained with mascara. I did not stop. I did not offer a hand. I pushed through the swinging gallery gates and walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. The air tasted crisp. The long war was finally over. But the true devastation for the Wilson family had only just begun. The federal government does not move slowly when a $12 million Ponzi scheme is exposed with an indexed evidentiary binder. The fallout was swift, surgical, and brutal. Within 48 hours, the Securities and Exchange Commission secured emergency court orders. They froze every bank account tied to David Wilson. They froze his corporate holdings, his offshore tax shelters, his personal checking accounts, and his hidden crypto wallets. Federal agents raided his lavish downtown corporate headquarters. They seized servers, boxed up hard drives, and padlocked the glass doors. The media got wind of the raid immediately. By Tuesday evening, David's mugshot was plastered across the front page of every financial news website in the country. The headline read, "The Architect of a Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud." The destruction of David's financial illusion hit Caroline the hardest. Her entire identity was built on a carefully curated Instagram feed of luxury vacations, designer handbags, and casual wealth. That digital fairy tale disintegrated in real time. On Wednesday morning, a flatbed tow truck pulled into the circular driveway of their sprawling suburban estate. Two burly men in heavy work boots walked up to her front door holding clipboards. Caroline ran outside screaming and waving her arms, but her protests were useless. The men handed her a stack of repossession orders. David had never owned the matte black vehicle or the white sports car. He had leased them through a shell company using investor funds. Since the accounts were frozen, the payments had bounced. Caroline stood sobbing on her lawn as the tow truck hauled away her only remaining symbols of status. But the humiliation did not stop with the cars. Later that afternoon, a process server arrived at the estate. He marched past the empty driveway and taped a yellow foreclosure notice directly to the front door. David had taken out 3 massive secondary mortgages on the house to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. With the primary income stream severed, the bank moved immediately to protect their collateral. Caroline frantically called her wealthy socialite friends, begging for a loan to cover the mortgage. Every one of them sent her calls directly to voicemail. The women who had happily drank her expensive champagne and attended her lavish parties vanished the instant her credit cards declined. She was isolated in a massive empty house she could no longer afford. The collateral damage spread rapidly, engulfing Richard in the process. He had spent his entire life cultivating a pristine reputation as a respected elder statesman of the local business community. He believed his wealth and connections made him untouchable. The federal indictment shattered that delusion. The authorities did not care about his golf handicap or his charitable donations. They cared about the forged power of attorney he had knowingly signed to help his son steal my property. On Thursday morning, the district attorney charged Richard with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and perjury. He was forced to surrender his passport and wear a tracking monitor while awaiting trial. The social execution was even more painful for Richard than the legal peril. The exclusive country club where he had held court for decades took swift and decisive action. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to revoke his membership, citing a morality clause in the club bylaws. When Richard attempted to enter the clubhouse dining room for his Friday lunch, the general manager stopped him at the door. In front of a dozen wealthy patrons, the manager quietly but firmly asked him to leave the premises and never return. The men Richard had golfed with for 20 years looked away and pretended to study their menus. He was officially a social pariah, stripped of his dignity and cast out of the only world he valued. Patricia watched her husband age a decade in a matter of days. Their sprawling estate was eerily quiet. The phone never rang. The invitations stopped coming in the mail. Their bank accounts were bleeding dry from exorbitant legal retainer fees. The reality of their spectacular downfall finally penetrated her thick shell of denial. They were completely destitute. David was sitting in a federal holding cell. Richard was facing an imminent criminal trial and complete financial ruin. Caroline was mere days away from being evicted from her foreclosed mansion. They had alienated everyone who could help them. They had burned every bridge and exhausted every line of credit. The crushing silence of their ruined lives left them with only one terrifying realization. Patricia sat at her dining room table, staring at a stack of unpaid legal bills. Caroline sat across from her, shivering in the cold house because the utility company had shut off the gas. They looked at each other with hollow, terrified eyes. The arrogance that had defined them for decades was gone, replaced by raw, primal desperation. They were completely out of options. They were facing absolute poverty and public disgrace. The bleak situation forced them to swallow their immense pride. It forced them to do the one thing they had sworn they would never do. They had to go to the only person who still held all the cards. They had to beg the woman they had tried to destroy. The torrential rain battered the massive glass windows of my corner office. I stood on the 50th floor of the Apex Group skyscraper, looking down at the gray, sprawling grid of downtown. The storm had rolled in overnight, washing away the stifling humidity and replacing it with a biting cold. My phone buzzed on the polished mahogany desk. It was a direct line from the ground floor security desk. I answered and listened to the head of building security explain the situation. Two women were currently causing a massive disruption in the main lobby. They were completely soaked from the rain and refusing to leave the premises. They were demanding immediate access to the executive suites and claiming a direct familial relationship with the CEO. The security chief asked if I wanted them escorted out of the building by force. I knew exactly who was waiting downstairs. The sheer desperation must have finally overwhelmed their pristine aristocratic pride. I instructed the security team to let them wait by the reception desk. I told him I would come down to handle the situation personally. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit and walked out to the private executive elevator. The descent was smooth and silent, giving me a moment to compose my thoughts. When the steel doors glided open on the ground floor, the visual contrast was jarring. The lobby of my building was a temple of modern corporate power. It featured pristine white marble floors, massive abstract sculptures, and a towering waterfall wall. Standing right in the middle of that pristine environment were my mother and my sister-in-law. Patricia and Caroline looked entirely broken. The relentless storm outside had shown them absolutely no mercy. Patricia was wearing a beige cashmere trench coat that was completely plastered to her fragile frame. Her perfectly styled blonde hair hung in wet, stringy clumps around her pale face. Caroline looked even worse. She was shivering violently in a ruined silk blouse. Her expensive designer mascara had completely washed away, leaving dark, hollow circles under her eyes. The luxury leather handbags they carried were waterlogged and ruined. They stood huddled together near the security turnstiles, looking like two shipwreck survivors who had just washed ashore. They were dripping rainwater all over the polished marble floor. The receptionists and passing executives were staring at them with thinly veiled disdain. I walked slowly across the lobby. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone floor. I stopped 10 feet away from them. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited. Patricia saw me first and let out a strangled, gasping sob. "Audrey, thank God you are here," Patricia cried out, her voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "You have to help us. Please tell these guards to let us upstairs. We need to sit down. We are freezing." "You are not going upstairs," I stated flatly, keeping my voice low and authoritative. "You have 5 minutes to explain why you are disrupting my building before I let security physically remove you." Caroline lunged forward, grabbing the velvet rope of the security stanchion. She looked absolutely feral. "You have to stop this, Audrey." She shrieked, ignoring the stares of the passing corporate lawyers. The bank locked the doors. They put a bright yellow notice on my house. The movers threw my children out onto the wet grass. We have nowhere to sleep tonight. David is in a federal holding cell and they are refusing to grant him bail. You have to call your lawyers. You have to tell them to drop the civil suits against the estate. Patricia pushed past Caroline and reached out as if to grab my hands. I stepped back smoothly, avoiding her touch. Her hands fell empty to her sides. Your father is wearing a tracking monitor, Audrey. Patricia wept, her voice breaking into a pathetic whine. He cannot even leave the county. The legal fees are draining everything we have left. His so-called friends have completely abandoned him. The country club banned him. He is a broken man. You have made your point. You proved how smart and powerful you are. You won the war. Now, you have to fix it. You have the money. You have the resources. You are the only one who can pay Richard's bail and secure a decent defense attorney. I stared at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the sister-in-law who had mocked my career and sneered at my choices. They were standing in a puddle of their own making, begging for my resources. You helped David forge a federal document to steal my property. I reminded them, my tone clinical and detached. You actively participated in a scheme to leave me with absolutely nothing. You laughed when you thought I was going to lose my inheritance. You celebrated my apparent downfall. But we are family. Patricia screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the marble walls. She pressed a wet, trembling hand against her chest. Blood is thicker than money, Audrey. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood. We are your family. You are my daughter. You cannot just stand there and let your own mother face public ruin and absolute poverty. We made terrible mistakes, but we are still family. You have to save us. Caroline nodded frantically beside her. Just write the check, Audrey. Caroline begged, her teeth literally chattering from the cold. Just give us enough to clear the immediate debts and secure a private rental. It is a fraction of what you have. You will not even miss the money. Please. I am begging you. I looked at the two women who had tormented me for my entire existence. They were staring at me with a sickening mixture of entitlement and desperation. They were expecting me to yield, to finally crave their love enough to buy it right here today. I stared at their trembling forms and felt absolutely nothing. For 33 years, I had desperately craved their validation. I had spent my childhood twisting myself into knots trying to earn a single glance of genuine affection from my mother. I had spent my early adulthood attempting to prove my worth to a family that viewed my very existence as a frustrating inconvenience. They had conditioned me to believe that their love was a commodity I could purchase if I just achieved enough, sacrificed enough, or stayed quiet enough. Looking at them now, dripping wet and shivering under the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate lobby, I realized how utterly pathetic that illusion had always been. They did not want forgiveness. They did not want reconciliation. They only wanted my checkbook. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or gloat. The profound clarity of the moment required no theatrics. The bustling activity of the ground floor had slowly ground to a halt. The passing executives, the security guards, and the receptionists were all watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. The ambient noise of the massive building seemed to evaporate, leaving only the sound of the torrential rain beating against the 50-foot glass windows behind us. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely devoid of emotion. I looked directly into my mother's tear-streaked eyes. I only came down to this lobby out of pity, so I won't stay long. The words landed with the physical force of a heavy stone dropping into a stagnant pond. Patricia flinched visibly. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The familiar phrase, the exact cruel dismissal she had used against me for decades, finally echoed back at her. The devastating symmetry of the moment paralyzed her. I shifted my gaze to Caroline. She was still gripping the velvet rope, her knuckles white from the strain. You are not crying because your husband is sitting in a federal holding cell, Caroline, I said, my voice slicing through the quiet lobby. You are crying because the bank took your leased sports cars and your country club friends will not return your calls. You happily spent millions of dollars of stolen money. You wore designer gowns bought with the life savings of innocent investors. You sneered at me and called me a failure while your husband was operating a massive criminal enterprise to fund your shallow lifestyle. You do not care about family loyalty. You only care about maintaining your artificial status. Your outrage is nothing but a performance because you have finally run out of other people's money to spend. Caroline dropped her gaze to the marble floor. She let go of the velvet rope and wrapped her arms around her own waist, sobbing quietly into the damp fabric of her ruined blouse. She had absolutely no defense. I turned my attention back to Patricia. My mother stood shivering, her face pale and drawn. "And you dare to speak to me about family blood?" I continued, my tone dropping to a dangerous clinical whisper. "You dare to invoke the concept of family loyalty after you stood in a courtroom and watched your husband and your golden child try to steal my inheritance. You watched them forge federal documents. You watched them commit perjury. You knew exactly what they were doing and you fully supported it. You only remember that we share the same DNA when you need a scapegoat to blame for your mistakes or a bank to fund your spectacular failures." Patricia stepped forward, extending a shaking hand. "Audrey, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You are my daughter. I raised you. I gave you everything. You cannot just abandon us to the streets. We will lose everything. The scandal will destroy the family name. You have to drop the civil injunctions. You have to pay the bail. It is your duty as a daughter. Your family name is already destroyed," I stated flatly. "Your husband is facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy. Your son is facing the exact same fate for orchestrating a $12 million Ponzi scheme. They built a house of cards on lies and theft and arrogance. They willingly handed the federal government the evidence required to lock them away. I did not destroy this family. I simply stopped allowing you to use me as the foundation for your fraud." The absolute finality of my words crushed the last remaining spark of hope in Patricia's eyes. The manipulative matriarch who had ruled her suburban empire with an iron fist was completely broken. She sank to her knees right there in the middle of the pristine white marble lobby. She buried her face in her wet hands and began to weep uncontrollably. Her loud, desperate sobs echoed off the towering waterfall wall. Caroline sank down onto the floor next to her, weeping into her hands. Two wealthy, arrogant women reduced to begging in a puddle of rainwater. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I just felt a profound sense of closure. The heavy, suffocating chains of my childhood trauma simply dissolved. They had no power over me anymore. Their tears meant nothing. Their begging meant nothing. They were just strangers dealing with the consequences of their own actions. I looked away from them and made eye contact with the head of building security. He was standing a few feet away, watching me with intense focus, waiting for my command. "Show them out," I instructed, my voice carrying clearly across the silent lobby. "If they attempt to return to this building, have them arrested immediately for criminal trespassing." The security chief nodded sharply and motioned for two of his guards to move forward. I did not wait to watch the guards pull my mother and my sister-in-law up from the wet floor. I turned my back on them and walked away. The morning air at the top of the world tasted entirely different today. 6 months had passed since that chaotic afternoon in the lobby of the Apex Group building. I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse, 50 stories above the bustling city streets. The relentless storms of that previous season had given way to a brilliant, cloudless spring. The golden sunlight reflected off the glass facades of the skyscrapers, creating a dazzling display of light and shadow. I leaned against the glass railing and let the gentle breeze wash over my face. The city below moved with a rhythmic, synchronized energy, but up here everything was perfectly silent. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my porcelain mug. The dark roast coffee was rich and complex. It tasted like absolute victory to me. I turned my attention from the skyline and looked down at the sleek digital tablet resting on the wrought iron table. The screen glowed brightly, displaying a 3D architectural rendering. The image slowly rotated, showcasing a magnificent structure composed of sustainable timber, massive glass panels, and natural stone. This was the crown jewel of the Apex Group portfolio. It was a sprawling multi-million-dollar eco-resort designed to blend seamlessly into the rugged landscape. The location coordinates glowing in the bottom corner of the screen were familiar to me. It was the exact footprint of the old Tahoe cabin site, the very same property my family had forged federal documents to steal. The structure had been demolished and cleared away. In its place, a monument to sustainable luxury was rising from the dirt. They had tried to take my inheritance to fund their fraudulent lifestyle. I had turned that barren plot into a highly profitable enterprise. A soft chime emanated from the tablet, breaking the quiet tranquility of the morning. A secure email notification slid across the top of the screen, rendering. The sender was Diane Hopkins, my lead attorney. The subject line read, "Final Status Update." I tapped the notification and opened the document. The text was clinical, precise, and devoid of emotion, which was exactly how I preferred my legal briefings. I read the first paragraph detailing the conclusion of the proceedings. David had been sentenced. The judge had shown absolutely no leniency regarding the multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. He was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. The email noted his requests for a transfer to a minimum security white-collar facility had been permanently denied. The golden boy of the family, the man who had built his life on stolen money, was now wearing a uniform and adhering to a schedule. I scrolled down to the second section of the email. This portion detailed the final disposition of Richard and Patricia. The civil suits, the bank foreclosures, and the immense mountain of legal debt had completely eradicated their carefully curated empire. The sprawling suburban estate had been auctioned off to satisfy their creditors. The offshore accounts were seized. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. The country club memberships were revoked. Diane provided their new residential address. It was a tiny two-bedroom rental apartment in a neighborhood. The social exile was absolute and permanent. The wealthy friends who had once attended their dinner parties now pretended they did not exist. The business partners who had played golf with Richard now avoided his disgraced name. They had been erased from the elite social circles they sacrificed their morality to maintain. The final paragraph provided a brief update on Caroline. After David was incarcerated, she attempted to salvage her status by fleeing to a distant relative. The email indicated she was currently working a minimum wage retail job, struggling to maintain a fraction of the lifestyle she felt she deserved. The designer handbags and luxury vacations were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of the working-class life she had once openly mocked. I read the entire document twice. I searched my heart for any lingering sympathy, any familial obligation, or any heavy guilt. There was nothing. The emotional reservoir where my childhood trauma had once lived was dry. For 33 years they demanded my obedience while praying for my failure. They labeled me the black sheep, the difficult child, the ungrateful daughter. They built a cage of expectations and tried to lock me inside it. When I broke free, they tried to destroy my foundation. They wove a web of lies, deceit, and financial crimes to sustain an illusion of superiority. I had not caused their destruction. I merely stepped out of the way and allowed gravity to do its work. Their own greed and arrogance had pulled them down into the abyss. They had constructed their own ruin brick by brick. I closed the email application and swiped back to the rotating rendering of the Tahoe Eco Resort. The digital sunlight caught the edge of the virtual glass, creating a brilliant flare. I pressed the button on the side of the tablet, putting the screen to sleep. The black glass reflected my own face. I looked rested, healthy, and alive. The dark circles of stress and anxiety that had heavily plagued me for decades were completely gone. I set the tablet down gently next to my coffee mug. I slowly walked back to the edge of the balcony and gripped the railing. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp morning air. The weightless sensation in my chest was extraordinary. It was the peace of a woman who had cut off the dead weight of a toxic past and built her own empire from the wreckage. There were no more ghosts hiding in the shadows. There were no more voices whispering in my ear. The war was over and the silence was incredibly beautiful. I opened my eyes and looked out over the vast, limitless horizon of the city that I had now completely conquered, and then I softly smiled.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.